Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Integrating Motivational Interviewing within Employment Services for Income Assistance Recipients. My name is Greg Lockwood and I am a researcher with the BC Centre for Employment Excellence and the Social Research and Demonstration Corporation. Today's webinar reviews evidence to date on integrating the motivational interviewing approach into case management in employment services as an approach to try to engage and motivate income assistance clients to improve their work readiness and participate in the labor market. We include results from 2 recent BC projects, as well as one in Manitoba, that add to the evidence base on what it takes to implement the approach successfully in employment services settings. Today's guest presenter is Ruben Ford, Research Director and my colleague at the Social Research and Demonstration Corporation. Ruben has extensive experience in the design and analysis of interventions spanning education, employment, social assistance, family well-being, and disabilities. Since 2003, he has been directing SRDC's team investigating approaches to increase access to post-secondary education across Canada. He directed the Self-Sufficiency Project and Motivational Interviewing Pilot Project, initiatives seeking to help long-term assistance recipients take up employment and help to design the Disability Supports Feasibility Study and Community Employment Innovation Project evaluations. Before joining SRDC in 1998, he spent 5 years as a research fellow and senior fellow at the Policy Studies Institute, a UK non-profit research institute. He is a credentialed evaluator, as recognized by the Canadian Evaluation Society, and a member of the Canadian Economics Association and the Association for Public Policy Analysis and Management. Today's presentation will last about 45 minutes, leaving some time for questions and discussion. You are encouraged to submit your questions and comments to Ruben in the questions feature of your panel. We will address questions during and at the end of the presentation. So now it is my pleasure to hand over the mic to Ruben.
Thank you very much, Greg. There we go. So this talk today is about the project that we did funded by the Government of Canada, Province of British Columbia, through the Social Development, Social Innovation, Research and Innovation Fund, called Integrating Motivational Interviewing within Employment Services for Income Assistance Recipients. A lot of people will ask whether motivational interviewing should indeed be considered an innovation. It's been used in the employment services sector for at least 10 years now. But we took the view in developing this project that innovation is there to solve a problem. In the case of this project, that's that there are employment obligated income assistance clients who are not moving ahead with their employment plans. And really, MI would only stop being an innovation when it has been utilized to the maximum extent possible to solve the problem. And we're trying to find out the ways that we can do that. So although there's lots of enthusiasm around motivational interviewing, and it is in use in employment services across the country, it's not yet fully utilized to help all income assistance recipients, and we need to find out the ways to try to make that possible. I'm going to be talking about findings from 4 projects actually on how it can be utilized and the effects of doing so. And I'm going to include some reflections from those in the field, case managers who've been using the approach, as well as, of course, the conclusions of researchers involved in at least 3 of the 4 projects that I'm going to include. And there's still innovation to be achieved. As you might expect, we don't conclude with the full story. So I will begin by telling you a little bit about the structure of this webinar. I'm going to begin by going through why we might want to use motivational interviewing in employment services settings. In particular, what is the policy problem that may be solved by motivational interviewing, one due to ambivalence, clients having mixed or opposing or even contradictory ideas about what they should be doing with their lives, and then how motivational interviewing actually addresses that ambivalence. I'm going to talk about the study design and the context of the existing evidence for motivational interviewing in this area. And then I will talk about the impacts of motivational interviewing in the projects that I review, including the current one on particularly employment and assistance outcomes, but also client behaviors and perceptions. I'm going to give you results from implementation research we did looking at the implementation of motivational interviewing in BC employment service centres, and some recommendations and next steps. So first of all, the rationale for this approach. There appears to be slow progress in employment services for some income assistance recipients. Those who are obligated to seek employment have many supports to help them to return to employment. The Work BC system provides resources for group workshops, individual sessions, training services, customized job placement and work experience placement services for clients with significant barriers to employment, self-employment assessment services, and financial supports. Yet many clients are not taking full advantage of the range of supports that are available to them, or they start out on those different supports and don't follow through. So they're not persisting with the resources that are available to them. So what that means in practice is that income assistance clients are not finding it straightforward to move on to employment, to leave income assistance. I have a chart here which shows the number of employment obligated income assistance clients over the past 2.5 years, and we can see that the numbers have been actually increasing from around 27,000 to 33,000. And importantly, the proportion of the clients in every month that is plotted on this chart who actually leave by the next month has been going down, which means actually that the number has been going down as well. So this is a problem that persists in dealing with the income assistance clients, that there's a reduction in the rates at which these clients are leaving income assistance. So why might we need a new approach to increase the transitions to employment of income assistance clients? It may be the case that we're designing services with the wrong assumption, that we're actually assuming people on income assistance are in a position to actively engage in changing their lives. But it could also be the case that those clients are not ready to make changes. Many clients may have lost confidence in their ability to secure employment. They may have tried several times in the past, not made that transition, and may have lost their motivation to continue to try. This may lead to them having low self-confidence and low self-esteem, and that could challenge them in making the effort to make changes. And in turn, that can lead to a vicious circle, leading to failure in and dropping out of the programs that could actually provide the services and support that they need. So we might be making an important omission in our employment development work. If the job seekers that we're dealing with are at different stages of readiness, and we're providing services that assume that they're fully ready to take on those services, we may be making a mistake. We may need to do something first before offering the services to make sure they're motivated to follow through. And that is what motivational interviewing is about. What it does, in essence, is change the communication between case managers and their clients. It's an approach that's intended to help somebody move towards making changes by focusing on and resolving any ambivalence they have with respect to how they want to make changes in their lives. So we're trying to facilitate and engage the intrinsic motivation within the client to change behavior, rather than having that motivation forced upon them from outside. And to do this, motivational interviewing seeks to promote the participant to talk about the idea of making changes in their lives and to initiate that talk themselves, something that is called change talk. In this way, clients' readiness for change can be increased because they own the idea of making changes in their lives, rather than having to follow instructions being given to them by others. What the approach also involves is trying to assess how ready the client is to make changes in order to determine whether motivational interviewing is required, when it should be used, and when the client may be ready to take on board further steps in their employment plans. So in essence, motivational interviewing is a fairly subtle change in practice because it's changing the communication style, not the overall structure, but at the same time it leads to a very critical change because it changes the ownership of the plan for moving forward. The primary authors of the key volume, the manual on using motivational interviewing, are Miller and Rolnick, and I quote here their interpretation of what motivational interviewing is. It's a goal-orientated style of communication with particular attention to the language of change, designed to strengthen personal motivation for and commitment to a specific goal by eliciting and exploring the person's own reasons for change within an atmosphere of acceptance and compassion. This approach has been developed, and many examples exist in this book, of the use of motivational interviewing in criminal justice, in health and addiction settings. But the translation to use in employment services is relatively recent compared to those other areas. And so we're still learning about how best to apply it in employment services. In essence, though, the approach is the same. It's about trying to restructure the way we have conversations so that clients are more likely to initiate talk about their desire and need for making important changes in their lives. And in the interaction with their case managers, clients are being guided to speak more often about the advantages of making changes than the advantages of not making changes. And then clients should hear themselves using this type of language about why they need to make changes in their lives. Now, I'm not an MI trainer. I'm not going to give a workshop now on how to use MI, but I'll try to give you an idea about how it works. In this box in the corner, I show the framework for motivational interviewing. Contains 4 processes: engagement, focusing, evoking, and planning. In essence, these 4 processes are staged. We should go through first engaging with the client. An example here is, are we going to walk together through this problem? Are we going to talk about this? And then we move to focusing. So where are we going to walk? Then evoking, why do we want to go there? And that's when the motivational interviewing in particular, the approaches in MI will come into play. And then we would move to the planning stage. How are we going to go about making this journey? So these 4 stages are all critical to the process. Only the 3 are truly necessary for MI. What we already do in case management a great deal is the planning stage. We move to planning fairly quickly, but it's not a necessary step for MI. It's necessary for employment services, but not necessary for MI. But the first 3 are necessary for MI. And what we're doing here is helping the client go through a process, leading them into their conversation where they will build their own argument for why they ought to be making changes in their lives. In practicing MI, there are 4 principles that should be followed. Expressing empathy, which is largely through applying counseling skills, OIRS, open-ended question, asking open-ended questions, not closed questions, providing affirmations of what the client has said, reflective listening, and providing summary statements. So the client is supported in their contributions to this conversation, and they hear their own words being fed back to them, and they understand that the counselor or case manager has heard their perspective. In MI, we also try to move on to the principle of developing discrepancy. Here, the client is encouraged to see the discrepancy between their present and their desired behavior, where they've talked about what they are currently doing versus what they would like to do. And in essence, MI here is drawing attention to the conflicts and contradictions between where they are compared to where they would like to be. But it should be the client and not the counselor that is identifying the reasons for that discrepancy. So in a way, that approach, that step, is amplifying the ambivalence, helping to see the differences between where you are and where you might want to be. Another principle of motivational interviewing is to roll with resistance. What this means is to help a client to reframe their resistance in order to create the conditions in which they may argue for change. So what a prompt might be here is, could you see that situation another way? Could you see where you are from another perspective? And encourage the client to come back with thinking about whether or not there is an option for them to change. And then finally, and very importantly, supporting self-efficacy is the fourth principle here. This is respecting clients' ability to make their own decisions, that ultimately they will follow through on their plans much more effectively if they are the ones to have made those decisions. So this approach has held a lot of promise in other sectors, in treatment of addictions, criminal justice, and health. But in applying it to employment services, one of the very first applications was in 2007 in a study in Winnipeg, where an organization called Opportunities for Employment explored the impact of training its case managers to use motivational interviewing in employment services. And this is the first of the four studies that I'm going to be drawing attention to in this part of the presentation. They had a randomly assigned phase where some of their clients were case managed by the motivational interviewing trained case managers, and some of their clients in a control group were case managed by non-MI trained case managers. And they found over the space of 6 months, the first group that got the MI trained case managers moved on to employment at a much faster rate than the control group, roughly 16 percentage points, a higher rate. And they found in a phase that followed, where they didn't use random assignment, that the first-time employment and sustainable employment rates improved over the first phase. So there was some very positive evidence emerging from that first study in Winnipeg. And SRDC and I was working for SRDC on this project in the Fraser Valley, which took lessons learned from the Stages of Change project in Winnipeg and applied them to working with Work BC centres in the Fraser Valley, using an increased focus on income assistance clients, not just the cross-section of clients walking into the Winnipeg office that was involved in the first study, but focusing in on those who were long-term employment obligated clients. I'll give you the results from that study in a moment. Talk about the other two studies that we've been involved with. SRDC then took the approach back to Winnipeg, but instead of training case managers in the employment service centers, they trained the case coordinators who actually worked in the income assistance offices. We took that approach also in the Fraser Valley study, but this was where we used it just with the people who were working in the front line in income assistance offices. And there, the offices that received training were randomly assigned, and we tracked the outcomes for clients who went to different offices. There also, MI was being compared to intentional practice rather than a null control group. So the case managers who were trained in motivational interviewing would use MI with their clients. The other case managers who were not trained in MI would be using intentional practice, which encouraged caseworkers to have more conversations with their clients to help them reach goals, but didn't teach them the core principles of using MI. And we were comparing those two approaches. And that study ran for 3 years until 2016. And then the current project, which has only just completed, the BC Centre piloted MI training case managers only, without training those working in their respective IA offices. Trained those case managers to use MI in a set of 7 Work BC centres in the Lower Mainland. And those clients have been followed up for a year in all three of the SRDC and center projects. We found out what the impacts were over time. So just give a little bit of credit to the other people involved in the more recent project. In fact, in 3 of the 4 projects, we've been working with Empowering Change, the MI trainers. Roxanne Sawatsky is the key trainer in this program. She has worked with the case managers in the MIPP project in the Fraser Valley and with SRDC in the most recent project, and she also led the first project in Winnipeg with opportunities for employment. So we also have been very happy to partner with Back in Motion and Avia Employment Services to be able to work with their case managers, training them to use MI, and we've been able to engage 15 of the case managers across these 7 Work BC centers to learn how to use MI with their clients. The goals with the most recent project include assessing the impact of MI, trying to integrate it in employment services, but also to further explore what it takes to integrate MI into case managers' practice and what lessons we might learn about how to do that better in future. So you have here a couple of the publications that are available from Empowering Change that talk about specifically using MI in employment services centers. Most of these studies, I've talked about 4 here, including the most recent one, have used a fairly similar design, at least in part, which has involved random assignment. We have adopted these designs because we want to be fairly emphatic about the impacts that we see. Usually what happens with these studies is that the clients are approaching their case management for the first time will be randomly assigned to groups of case managers who have been trained in using MI or to groups who have not been trained in using MI. Sometimes those groups are within an office, sometimes they're assigned to different offices, depending on how the MI training has taken place. In this most recent design, we had 2 levels of random assignment. The case managers who were interested in the 7 Work BC centers that were taking part were randomly assigned at the outset to 2 groups. We had 15 slots in the training, and so we had effectively a lottery for getting the MI training. And the case managers who didn't win the lottery to get the training continued to be part of the study, and they were using their normal case managing techniques with their clients at the same time as the 15 who were trained to use MI. And we were able to assign clients to those 2 groups of case managers. So we have a kind of double random assignment design here that sees both the case managers randomly assigned to getting MI training and the clients being randomly assigned to those case managers. And what this does is helps to reassure those who are reading the results that the differences aren't necessarily due to differences in the kinds of case managers who would choose to take up the training, and aren't necessarily due to the kinds of MI clients who would see MI trained case managers versus those who wouldn't, because those decisions are made by a random draw and not being made by the clients or case managers themselves. So in this particular project, we see the activity happening over a year, primarily from mid-2015 towards the fall of 2016. And over that year, the clients were being enrolled into the study at the front desk of the Work BC centers, assigned to their case manager, who was either in the MI stream or the non-MI stream. And SRDC collected baseline data from those clients and followed up with those clients over time, 3 months later, to see what had happened to them, and then over a 12-month period with administrative data to see whether they have moved off income assistance, moved into employment. We did interviews with the MI trained case managers and observed their training sessions in order to get a full flavor of how MI worked for those case managers, and through the words of the case managers, how it worked for their clients. as well as tracking those outcomes in our final report. The final report's been released. It's currently on the BC Centre website, and we have some of the results in this presentation today. So this design is the one that we used in the most recent study, but the previous three were fairly similar in their design in using random assignment, at least in part of their evaluation. And it's a really broad summary of the impacts that we're seeing from these four studies that I mentioned are shown in this table. So here you have each of the studies in the 4 rows of the table. We have the number of people who were actually income assistance clients who were randomly assigned either to get MI or not, and we have who was actually delivering the MI. So in the case of the first study and the most recent one, it was just the counselors or case managers in the Employment Services Centre. In the case of the MI evaluation project, on the 3rd row, it was just those working in the IA offices. And in the MI pilot project, it was both groups. The results are varying by the population. We have here what happens with the control group, the group that don't get MI, and you can see that there's quite a bit of variation in their rates of movement into employment over the course of the study. In fact, the outcomes are slightly different. The first one looks at employment of those IA clients 6 months after enrollment. The second one looks at employment 3 months after enrollment. The third one is actually looking at departures from income assistance in a 9 to 12 months window after enrollment. And the most recent study looks at full-time employment 3 months after enrollment. You can see that the rates of movement in employment, even for the control group, are varying because the types of clients vary and obviously the settings and the locations vary. So what matters is not those rates, but the change that the MI brings about. So we can see that in the first study, MI brought about roughly a 10 percentage point increase in the rates of movement into employment, and that rate is statistically significant, as shown in the final column. The second study similarly saw a significant increase of a slightly smaller magnitude, 7 percentage points, as did the third study. But the study that we've most recently completed didn't see a significant increase. There was a small change in the increase in terms of an increase, but it was not a significant one. So statistically, we can't tell these numbers apart. We have to say the difference was not statistically significant. And that's partly due to the relatively small sample size that we were able to achieve in the most recent study. The first study had a much larger sample, as I mentioned, and MI was found significant across, to have a significant impact across the different groups of clients that were included, but I've only included here the figures for the income assistance clients who were in that study. So I'm going to tell you a few more of the results that we had from our most recent study. This is where in the Lower Mainland BC centres that we were working with, we looked at the change in the group that was receiving MI from MI trained case managers versus those whose case managers were not trained in MI. And we looked at a wide range of different types of outcomes we might have expected to see. Arguably, it's quite an expectation for somebody who's been on income assistance, particularly for a while, to move straight into employment within 3 months, but we might expect them to take up more services, we might expect them to make more effort in looking for work, we might expect there to be some changes in their self-confidence and self-esteem. Those changes might be more likely to be seen than the changes in employment. So we looked at a wide range of different outcomes, and this is the case for most of the studies. I'm just going to focus on the most recent one here. So in terms of the differences that we found that were significant, we did see an increase in referrals to other programs for the MI stream. The people who were getting MI were much more likely to be referred on in the first 3 months and indeed over the course of the whole year that we followed up clients. We didn't observe all of them over the full year just because we had to stop observing for some of those people before the 12 months window had been fully passed. But in the period in which we saw them, we certainly had more people getting referred to other programs. We didn't see any significant change in the receipt of income assistance. You can see there's some variation, particularly by month 8, but it wasn't a significant change. We didn't see any change in people's claiming of earnings which were reported to income assistance. And we saw a small increase in job search frequency, which was not significant when measured in terms of the number of jobs that have been looked for, but it was significant when we looked at it in terms of whether or not they'd increased their job search frequency. So on the bottom row here we see the proportion who had increased their job search frequency was 88% in the MI group, but only 65% in the non-MI group. And moving on to the next slide, we can see a number of other results where we didn't see changes that we might have expected. Although more people were studying in a program, again, because of our small sample size, we couldn't really say that those differences were statistically significant. We had a special scale that we applied called Eureka, the University of Rhode Island Change Assessment Scale. This tries to assess whether clients are willing to make changes in their lives. We didn't see a dramatic change on the scores on that scale for the people who had MI versus those who hadn't. And that's a difference from other projects where they typically do see those changes. Similarly, on scales that try to measure work readiness, try to measure life satisfaction, we didn't see a significant difference. The people who had MI were somewhat less likely to say that they had employment constraints at the 3-month point. The number of employment constraints reduced slightly, but they weren't more likely to see themselves as able to follow through on their plans. The self-efficacy scale was much the same. Job search clarity was much the same. Self-determination was much the same. So we're seeing either zero effects or fairly modest effects from this most recent implementation. And part of this, we don't find significance is because the sample size was small, but it's not going to explain the full story. To some degree, the implementation was challenging, and that's where a very interesting part of this study, where we focused in on what the challenges were implementing MI, come to the fore. It helps us to understand why, in this particular context, we may not be seeing as big an impact as in some of the earlier projects. So here I'm going to turn to the implementation research that we did, and the two sets of focus groups that we did with case managers. The first, about a month into using MI, about a month after the training sessions had finished, where case managers were getting to grips with using MI, and then about 6 months after that, where they were fairly comfortable with using MI, but where they were still learning, but where we had a better understanding of how MI was working with their clients. So here we have qualitative data for the most part, which we have summarized to draw conclusions about how readily MI fits within the set of the toolkit of case managers and any challenges that they had. And broadly, across the case managers that we interviewed who've been trained to use MI, they said they valued the training greatly. They found it very useful. Here's a quote from one: "I thought it was amazing. I feel like the new role of the case manager lacked that interpersonal element, and MI brought it back in a more holistic way for dealing with clients. I was terribly excited. I felt euphoric after the first day." So people talking about MI allowing them to engage with their clients in a more personal way and to help those clients to own their own plans for moving forward. They say the case managers say they found MI a potentially useful tool for employment counseling for clients in two particular situations, where those clients were ambivalent with respect to making a change in their lives, or where they were ambivalent about what they wanted to do. Even though they were motivated to make a change in their lives, they weren't necessarily ready to make a decision as to what that should be, and it helped them make a decision about what they should do next. This helped with empowering the client. Some used the phrase stoking the fire, and it allowed them to have this conversation on change focusing on moving forward that they hadn't necessarily been able to have before. So case managers were telling us that MI helped their clients to move forward with greater clarity with respect to making decisions and to achieve some intermediate goals which could help with their eventual transition to the labor market. Those are on the positive side. But we also had case managers who told us that they found there was a difference or an incongruity between the model they were following in terms of the priorities they had with processing clients and the sequencing of activities in their case management with fully integrating the MI approach. They, of course, had the MI training and they wanted to apply the full set of MI principles when they were seeing their income assistance clients. They wanted to express empathy, develop discrepancy, roll with resistance, support self-efficacy. But because there's an imbalance in the power between the case manager and the income assistance client, it was hard for them to fully implement, particularly the expression of empathy and to help to support self-efficacy, to get the client to be making the decisions, because there's an employment plan that the client was expected to follow through on that had already been to some degree written out for them. So they found it difficult to fully implement MI with the power relation that exists between case managers and income assistance clients. And to some degree it was also difficult because using MI could make conversations run a little longer or could require more meetings with the client. If you have a large caseload, it could be hard to do that, and case managers told us that it was sometimes hard for them to fully implement MI because they had large caseloads. So here's some quotes that illustrate that. It's so frustrating because I used it with this one client. She opened up and was crying. I didn't know she was battling all that stuff. But then I didn't see her for 3 to 4 weeks and we had to start back from scratch. So the frequency with which they're meeting wasn't sufficient. And then others talking about the Employment Readiness Information Questionnaire, which talks about some of the potential barriers to employment. In filling that out, you have to focus on barriers with the client at intake, and MI says that you don't focus on the barriers, but we have to ask certain questions that put lights on the barriers. So there's this incongruency between the intake process and getting clients on board for some of these case managers with actually fully implementing the principles of MI. But on the other hand, broadly speaking, not necessarily with all the IA clients, but across the client caseload that case managers had to deal with, MI was found useful and became part of how they worked and how they lived their lives. It was a tool that they could use in many different settings. So although we may not have seen the results for the income assistance clients that we were expecting, or at least as big an impact as we were expecting, we did see MI being used and case managers finding it to be a useful addition to their toolkit. But you don't need to just take my word for that. We have some case managers talking about their use of MI on a video that we produced for the project, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to show it through the seminar link. So I'm going to ask Greg to see if he can actually show that video.
There's quite a lot of evidence from research with people who rely on social assistance to suggest that when they receive their employment services from case managers trained in motivational interviewing, it makes a difference to their success in the labour market.
MI means to me people entering the labour market who would never have considered leaving income assistance. They're coming out of poverty because parents are entering the labour market. They're moving towards education when at one time they'd never even dream about that. And now they're thinking, why not? Who says I can't? And so that's what MI means to me, is connecting with those people that were forgotten.
When someone can find them within themselves the change, it's so much more powerful. It's so much more effective because they then own it, and then they can move forward, and we can be able to help support them along the way, partner with them along the way, but they're doing it. They're the ones that have made that decision.
MI is a goal-oriented, client-centered counseling style for eliciting behavior change by helping clients to explore and resolve ambivalence.
In motivational interviewing, we have a framework, and it's called the 4 processes. The first process is engagement. That's like building rapport. Second process is focusing, like us setting an agenda. What are we moving towards? And the third process is evoking, and that's the actual MI session. And we would only use that process if somebody's stuck. And then the last process is the planning process, which is what all practitioners are so familiar with. Let's move to planning. But before we move to planning, we want to make sure somebody isn't ambivalent about change. And if they are, go to evoking first.
In the past decade, there have been 3 studies in Western Canada adopting a very rigorous design. 2 in Manitoba and 1 in BC. These researchers randomly assign people to program and control groups so they are sure that motivational interviewing is making the difference. Results published so far show motivational interviewing added at least 7 or 8 percentage points to the rates at which people took up work after starting employment services.
I would share an example of my client. He was a severe alcoholic. So we were going through the process. He didn't like it. We rebooked the appointment. He came back again. I again wore my MI hat on, and we talked about the benefits, the strengths. This person is now sober, and he has cleared his real estate exam, and he's a realtor now.
Some of the challenges of getting case managers to use MI is lack of support from their supervisor. It can be policies that don't line up with motivational interviewing, and the expectation is to use MI to move clients forward, theoretically, but policy isn't supporting that. There's a conflict for the case managers. So there has to be a clear message that supervisors support it, managers support it, upper leadership support it, and there's time for the case managers to learn and practice MI. If they're supported, they'll stick with it. If not, you can train an organization and put a lot of investment financially into training the case managers. Unless they're supported, they'll go back to their old approach, usually within 3 months.
Together with what we are learning from the latest study for the BC Centre for Employment Excellence, it would make sense for decision makers in employment services to support case managers to use motivational interviewing more often.
It has brought more confidence in the work I do, and has changed my outlook of how I look at people.
A little bit about me is that I was once like a client. I was once stuck, and single mom with 3 children, living really stuck, and somebody used a different approach with me, and I moved forward, and here I am years later with a master's degree, completed school when that was not even something that I could have ever imagined doing.
So I just want to sum up really by giving you some of the lessons learned from the project. Our results fell short of expectations and some of the promise that had been seen, particularly in the Manitoba implementations. Although even in our earlier implementation in the Fraser Valley, we did see among long-term income assistance clients who really over a 3-month period did not transition to employment at all, we helped to move 1 in 10 of them onto employment in that short period of time. We didn't see that in the most recent implementation, and so it seems that the approach could potentially have more support within the system and may be able to be implemented more thoroughly and more regularly. It seems that it can fit within the existing systems, and it is a useful tool, but we need to be cognizant that the sequence with which we process clients at the present time and the funding structure perhaps by which we are able to support different activities with clients needs to be reviewed with respect to how motivational interviewing can be integrated into that process without upsetting the framework and the principles of using MI. At the same time, of course, there are some aspects of the approach which cannot be changed. The power relation between case managers and income assistance workers and clients is always going to be an issue, that this practice is going to, MI practice is always going to need to be able to work in a setting where there is some power differential between client and case manager. The full empathetic role will be very hard to achieve, maybe over time, but certainly not from the outset. So MI practice itself is also going to need to think about ways in which it can be adapted or to be effective in settings where there will inevitably be some differential in the power relations. So perhaps some change from the system, but also some change from developing MI in new ways as well. So those are the recommendations coming out of this particular project. I'd urge you to read more about it in our report. If you didn't catch the whole of the video, you'll also find the link to that on the center site, and I welcome any questions.
Okay, thank you, Ruben. So I just sent a message to everyone to please send in your questions. We still have a few minutes where we can take some questions for Ruben to answer. I think maybe I'll kick it off while everyone out there thinks of what they may want to ask Ruben. But I guess following up on some of the recommendations that you outlined there, Ruben, in terms of looking at new ways of piloting or testing MI, are there any, is there anything that's currently in the works about running another, whether it's a rigorous demonstration trial for MI here in BC or in other provinces, or even in any other jurisdictions?
I'm not aware of any immediately, but I think there are opportunities all the time. Anytime an organization is thinking of working with motivational interviewing, there's an opportunity to study it, and I'd urge them to try to do that. But the key thing is we've been studying this in a particular area, which is long-term income assistance clients. There may be lessons to be learned about working with different groups of clients. We've never really secured a large enough sample to be able to differentiate whether this works better for certain groups of clients than others, for example, in male clients versus female, or Indigenous clients, for example. It would be very interesting to see for which groups it is more effective, and to tease out the changes in the system that may make it easier to implement. So again, it would be helpful to have an environment where we will be able to incentivize the use of MI as frequently as possible in the early interactions between case managers and their clients, and perhaps pull back on the initial intake questionnaires. And we don't really have the freedom to experiment that much, but it would be good to try to create an environment where that was possible, to see how far we can facilitate bigger impacts by changing the system as well.
Okay. And we have had a few questions come in. The first question is asking if there were any differences in the time spent with clients, this is a great question, between the Manitoba study compared to the most recent study that you're aware of.
Yeah, so I'm afraid we don't have the kind of time and motion study evidence to answer that. My impression is that the amount of time being spent with clients is longer when the case managers are using MI than it is normally, initially. But then over time, there are actually fewer meetings. Then the clients need to come back less often. So overall, you might see, if you're adding up the minutes over a 3-month or 6-month period, there will be less time being spent with the client. But in the initial phase, of the first few weeks, there would be more. That doesn't really answer the question as to whether that accounts for the difference in the impacts, and I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that. We haven't been measuring it.
Okay. And this person's also wondering if there were any effects shown in how long clients maintain employment after receiving MI. So I know a lot of the follow-up was I think all in the less than 12-month range. Were you able to capture any of those effects, maintaining employment after receiving MI?
Yeah, we're kind of caught within the time span of a project. We're limited in how long we can follow people up. So I don't know about the long-term outcomes. For sure, we monitor people for the full 12 months wherever we could, and we didn't see people returning returning out of work, returning to benefit more quickly. It wasn't like it was a short-lived impact, but at the same time, over time, the control group does gradually catch up. So this is about helping people to move into employment more quickly, and they stay in employment, and then gradually over time, through whatever other means, clients do eventually make it as well. But of course, they've spent a lot longer on income assistance in the meantime. So that's what I do know. But beyond the 12-month point, we don't have much data. I don't think any of the studies have taken a longer-term horizon than that.
Okay, and finally here, do you have any information about whether the income assistance clients were new clients to Work BC, so that is short-term unemployed, or were they already existing Work BC clients, longer-term unemployed?
It was a condition for recruitment that they were not existing clients, so that they had to be new. We did that partly because we didn't want to upset the case management arrangement they may have already had. They might have had a case manager they would have expected to see, and of course we can't then introduce MI into that relationship. So they had to be new clients.
Okay, and we got one more question that just came in. It has to do with the consent and participants being aware that they're part of the project. So the question is, were the clients aware before, during, or after that they were receiving MI during sessions? What exactly do they know when they sign up for the project?
Yeah, that's right. We had an informed consent process with both of the studies that I was responsible for, and I think all four studies involved consent. It's actually very difficult to explain to a client in a research consent what motivational interviewing is. In essence, it means that you will be having a conversation with your case manager in a different way, possibly. Possibly it could be that the case manager would already have structured the conversation this way. So that's very hard to explain. We told people that they would be taking part in the study and that we would be collecting data from them over time, and that as a result of being in the study, they would be receiving employment services using a new approach. But we didn't tell them specifically that it was motivational interviewing because of the difficulty of explaining to a client precisely how that would change. And for most of the clients, they wouldn't necessarily know explicitly that things had changed, except that many clients I've heard secondhand said that they did notice that they were being treated differently.
Okay.
Generally, they interpret this as a situation where their views are being respected a little bit more often, and they had they felt more comfortable with the outcomes of their interactions. But I'm hearing that secondhand. We don't have much evidence in our 3-month follow-up survey of improvements in self-esteem and confidence that might follow through from that, but certainly to some degree I think the clients detected it. But even so, it would have been very hard to explain in the consent form that would have happened. I still think it was ethical in that sense, because we told them they were taking part in the study and that they would receive employment services in a different way, but we just couldn't go beyond that in explaining NI.
Certainly. Okay. Well, that's going to wrap it up for the Q&A period for today's presentation. I want to thank Ruben again for that really informative presentation, and of course thanks to all of you out there for attending. Today's session was recorded, so we will post the video of the presentation on the Center's website, and we will send you all a link in an email within the next week. As always, we welcome your input and feedback, so when you leave the webinar, you will be asked to complete a short survey, and we would appreciate it if you took a minute or two to share your thoughts. That ends our event today. On behalf of Ruben and my colleagues here at SRDC and the Center, thank you for participating in today's discussion, and have a great afternoon.